Hi there, I'm Ben from the Merrimack Public Library, and this is If You Know, You Know Kitchen Survival. Today, we're going to be talking about how to make pancakes. First, I'll show you a simple, easy recipe for just standard American style pancakes that you're probably familiar with. That's going to be a great recipe for just like a casual weekend morning. And then we're going to try something a little bit more complicated but very impressive Japanese souffle style pancakes, which are these big, tall, fluffy, pillowy, almost cake like pancakes that are really fun to eat but take a little bit more practice. So, without any further ado, let's get to it. So before we get started, the first thing we want to do is make sure we have all of our ingredients. And for our standard pancake, that's going to be some all-purpose flour, some sugar, baking powder, a little bit of salt, some milk of your preferred variety. I'm using almond milk. The proportions should be exactly the same. A little bit of vanilla extract, some butter, and an egg. Now I'm going to make a half batch of these, so I'll tell you how many pancakes I end up with, and if you wanted to make more than that, you could double all of this, but I'm running low on eggs, so half batch it is for me. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is melt a tablespoon and a half of our butter. So using the markings on it, I'm going to chop off a tablespoon and a half. You can go straight through the wax if you want. It works better if the butter is still cold, though. Mine's a little warmed up, so it got a little squishy there. And I've got this glass microwave safe ramekin here that I'm going to put my butter into. And we're going to microwave this on about half power for a minute. Okay, so I've got my butter in my microwave safe container. And I'm going to cover this with some wax paper because the butter likes to splatter a little bit as it gets hotter. There's a little bit more wax paper than you probably need. And I'm going to give this 30 seconds on half power and see how that does. All right, so as you can see, 30 seconds, it's not quite melted, so we're gonna give it another 30. We can kind of just keep going like this until it's melted. All right, let's check on this again. All right, so after a minute, we've got some nice melted butter there. And now we're going to let this cool off. All right, so to get started, we're going to mix up our wet and our dry ingredients separately. This is going to help them get evenly incorporated to each other. So for our dry ingredients, we're starting with some all-purpose flour. We specifically want 3/4 of a cup. And I said in a past episode on the mug cake, I think, that the best way to measure dry ingredients is to take a little more than you need and then level off the top. And that's still true, but better than scooping, which will compress your flour some. For flour in particular, it's good to pour a little mound on top gently, and then when you scrape off, you've leveled off your flour, but you haven't pressed it down at all. And this will get you the closest or the most consistent results every time you do it. So this is a 1/4 cup measure, so I'm looking for 3 of these. So this is 1, this is number 2. And this will be 3. So I'm just gently scooping some out. I'm making a pile on top of my scoop here that goes over the top. And then I'm leveling it off without pressing it down at all. All right, so that's 3/4 of a cup of flour. I need 1 1/2 tablespoons of sugar here. So 1.5 tablespoons of sugar. I need 3/4 of a tablespoon of baking powder. So we're going to take out our 1/4 teaspoon measure. And for baking powder, you can go ahead and scoop. It doesn't compress as much. That's 1/4 teaspoon, 2/4 of a teaspoon, and 3/4 of a teaspoon. And if you remember from the mug cake episode, baking powder doesn't need an acid, but will be a little weaker, so you use a little more of it than baking soda. And we need 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I'm going to measure this over this ramekin so I don't spill. Because it comes out kind of fast. And we'll go ahead and level that. And just a little salt to add some flavor. And then I'm just going to whisk this together so it's all mixed up. And we can move on to our wet ingredients. All right, for wet ingredients, we're going to start with 1 egg, which I forgot to crack on camera, but you'll have to see some egg cracking for the Japanese souffle pancake if you want to. So we're going to have 1 egg, 3/4 of a cup of milk, or in this case, almond milk. And this could go up to a full cup. These are milk is the amount of liquid in your batter is one of those things that you can adjust to your taste based on the consistency that you see when it's done. We're going to add 1.5 teaspoons. 1.5 tablespoons of melted butter here. And lastly, we need 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla. I got a little bit of butter on my hands there. So 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla. And we're just gonna mix this together real quickly so that everything's homogeneous. Probably a bigger bowl for this would have been a good idea. All right, so once you've got everything mixed together in there, we can add our wet ingredients to our dry ingredients into a little well in the center and start incorporating them. Now, with pancakes, with pancake batter, you don't want to over mix. You want to go gently, and you just want to get most of the dry flour incorporated. If there's lumps, it's fine. But when you mix flour, you develop the gluten. And we like gluten in bread because it gives us those big air pockets and makes the interior of the bread chewy. But for pancakes, we want them very tender, usually. So we don't want to build up much gluten when we're mixing up a pancake batter. So if you get just no big streaks of flour left, just mix it. The lumps are fine. And we're going to let this sit for 5 to 10 minutes to hydrate some of those lumps of flour a little bit better before we start cooking. In the meantime, we can start preheating our skillet over medium heat. Okay, so I've got my griddle here heating up over medium heat. I'm going to add some butter to grease it up. You could also use a spray oil or no stick spray like Pam or something, or a neutral oil like vegetable oil or corn oil, whatever you prefer. I just happen to like using butter for this. So once you got that greased up, reminder to use your oven mitts when you're handling a hot cast iron pan. I'll give that. And once that's all heated up, you can be ready. You can start with your batter. You're all set to cook. Alright, so this has been going for a couple of minutes. I've let my batter rest for 5 to 10 minutes. You can go a little longer than that with no problem. It'll just help hydrate a little more, but you can't let it sit out forever because the baking soda is already, or baking powder rather, is already activated once you get it wet, and it'll run out eventually. So, you see we've got all these little bubbles coming up in here. That's our baking powder at work, and if we let it sit long enough, it would be all used up, and we wouldn't get the nice airy texture we want from our pancakes. So, the pan's hot. This is also the time when you want to check for your texture of your batter. Generally speaking, it'll thicken up a little bit if you let it sit out as the flour hydrates more. This is about where I like mine. You can adjust thinner or thicker as you like. It'll generally thinner batter will make thinner pancakes. One thing to watch out for if you're using butter like I am is if you leave it on a heat long enough, it can start to smoke a little bit, which mine is doing. So that might be an argument, which won't usually happen for that won't usually happen with oil. So that's one advantage that oil has over butter. Let's start cooking. So I'm using a ladle here. I'm gonna drip these in. And if you can just, whenever you go back to scoop, you try to hit the same spot. It'll just spread out into a nice circle. And let these go to about that size. If you like filling in your pancakes, you could add them into the previous step when you're mixing the batter. If you have, I don't know, some raisins maybe, or apples with cinnamon, something like that, you could just mix it right into the batter. And there are some things that you could add right now, like if you want chocolate chips or something like that, you could throw it in while the pancake is cooking as well. So now we're just going to let this sit here, don't touch it, for a couple of minutes. And what I want to look for is getting firm around the edges and bubbles coming up to the surface. And if the surface starts to dry out a little bit, that's probably a sign to check the bottom. For that, you're just going to want to lift up the edge and see how it's coming along. So we're just going to let this sit and cook for a couple minutes. So about this point is when the bubbles start coming up is when I might want to start checking. But the bottom edge isn't set, means it might be a little hard to flip. But I do like the color, so I'm just gonna give it a shot and see if I can flip this without wrecking it. Okay, so a little light over here. So our pan's, what this says is our pan's not heating totally evenly yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check underneath and see if you've got the pans relatively centered. Oh yeah, good tip that I wasn't necessarily following is if you're walking away from the stove, make sure you put your the angle of your handle all the way over so nobody coming by hits it, because you don't want to touch this, it's hot, and you don't want to send your food flying. So whenever you're walking away, best practice is move this handle so it's all the way away from the edge. So now, same thing, we're going to let this sit undisturbed. It'll take a little less time to finish cooking on the other side than it did on the first side, although the first side is a little pale. Ideally, you don't want to have to flip these multiple times, so if you can get the first side all the way done first, that's the best. So I'm just going to let that sit for a minute. doing. Alright, so we can give another one a shot. So ladle out some batter right in the center here. And I don't know if I have enough for another pancake, so I think I'm just going to add it all in. And like I said, if you wanted to add some toppings, you can go ahead and throw some chocolate chips in now. Now the downside of using chocolate chips this size, they might stick out of the batter and burn on the back a little bit. So little ones can be nice for making pancakes. So just throw some chocolate chips in like that and let it cook as you did before. All right, and when this guy is ready to flip, give him a flip. And let it finish cooking for another couple minutes. And after a couple minutes, it's all pretty much done. Stack it up. So there you have it, your basic American style pancakes. These are pretty easy. They do take a little bit of time, but they're totally delicious. I hope you guys give them a shot some lazy morning or when you're just in the mood for a special breakfast treat. All that's left to do now is dress them with butter, maybe maple syrup, and dig in.